Hello, sea creatures! Today we are going to ask the millennial-old question, how old was Yeshua slash Jesus slash Isa slash the big guy of Christianity when he died? Well, the notion for most Christians was that he died at 33. They come to this notion because of a three-tier process. Number one, the Bible is the only reliable source of truth for facts about Jesus Christ and his life. Number two, Luke 3:23a states this: now, Jesus himself was about 30 years old when he began his ministry. This statement is reinterpreted to say that Jesus was 30 when he began his ministry. And number three, we are definitely told that Jesus had lived during the time of Passover 3 times during the course of his ministry. In John 2:13, John 6:4, and around the time of his death in John 11:55. So therefore, easy math, 30 plus 3 equals 33. But this notion is wrong. I will now provide you with a more reliable truth by combining concrete historical data that we have outside of the Bible with more accurate historical markers that we have inside of the Bible. To do this, all we have to do is focus in around the time of his birth and the time of his death and guesstimate the closest possible range of dates that we could come up with those two dates and then subtract them, and then bada bing, bada boom, we have the best guesstimate that we can get for Jesus's date. First of all, there is no year zero. In the Julian calendar, 1 BC is directly followed by 1 AD. And secondly, in the Roman Empire, there are many festivals held in conjunction with the winter solstice, such as the Feast of the Unconquerable Sun. And when Christianity became the Roman religion, the Romans had a choice to either suppress the pagan religions or to Christify them. And since it's a lot easier to transform secular religions into religious ones than just to create a whole new one, they pretty much made the December 25th festival, which is the festival of the Son of the Sky, and it became the festival of the Son of God. And that is really the only reason why December 25th is the day that we celebrate Jesus' birthday, because of this Roman festival of the sun. So what hints are we given on the date of Jesus' birth in the Bible? Well, in Matthew 2:16, we are told that when Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. So 2 important time markers are actually given to us here. The first important thing to realize is that Herod is here. Herod died in 4 BC. That's a good historical marker that we have that I'll get it back into later. And the other thing that we got is that he killed boys 2 years old and younger. So if we were told that Herod was alive and that Jesus was born and that he had been alive for about 2 years before he gave this order to kill the babies before he died in 4 BC, that would mean that Jesus had to be born a couple of years even before that in 6 BC. According to Josephus, where we cite a lot of our dates for King Herod and others, Herod the Great died between a lunar eclipse and a Passover. It is generally agreed upon by scholars that the eclipse in question occurred in February of 4 BC, even though it was a partial eclipse and not an oh my gosh, an eclipse. Seeing that elsewhere in Josephus' writings, we get many signals pointing to Herod dying in 4 BC. It just helps to justify that Josephus intended that the partial eclipse in question to be the eclipse that he was referring to. Oh, looky here, a biblical contradiction. What a surprise. Luke and Matthew contradict each other on a couple of points. And the reason why this is a biblical contradiction is because Luke 2:1-2 gives us a slightly different time frame for the events surrounding Jesus' birth. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census would be taken of the entire Roman world. And in parentheses it says, this was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. This census, as depicted, could not have happened until 6 AD when Quirinius was appointed governor by Caesar Augustus, which happens to be a full 10 years after Herod the Great died. And secondly, Luke 2:39 says this: when Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. The Matthew account says that they went to Egypt once all this was done. The Matthew account as a whole looks like this. So the Matthew account is assumed to begin in Bethlehem, and Jesus is born. We have the account of the Magi, and then After the Magi, we say, hey, flee to Egypt, and they go to death in Egypt. And whenever they started coming back after Herod died, oh no, Archelaus, instead of going to Bethlehem, they bypassed to go to Galilee. You get nothing of Jerusalem. And the Luke account as a whole looks like this. It begins in Nazareth, where they go down to Bethlehem for the purposes of the census. Jesus is born, and then 8 days later, they get Jesus circumcised in Jerusalem, which is kind of an important part in Jewish custom. And then after they do that, it just says that they go back to Nazareth peacefully. No mention of Egypt. It just Jerusalem, Nazareth. So also in our research, we have found that the most likely source of the star that led the Magi westward towards Judea, it was a major convergence of planets that happened around February of 6 BC. And due to their special alignment and due to the lack of knowledge back then, it's like, oh, these lights are coming together. Oh, now it's really bright. That must mean something special has happened. It's just, that is what the Magi were following, is this major convergence of planets that happened at that time. Yeah, definitely check out the citations below the video to get more information on that, because I don't have time to go into all of that, but it's pretty interesting. Now, knowing this and assuming that the alignment of planets is in fact the star that the Magi saw, it actually makes sense for Herod to then kill all the babies in Bethlehem. Herod probably didn't know of Jesus specifically, so when the Magi alerted him of the rival and realized that he was tricked 2 years after February 6 BC, in 4 BC, he ordered the slaughter of the innocents, and that still gives him a couple months for him to die before Passover in 4 BC. If Jesus would in fact been born around the time of the census of Quirinius in 6 AD, Jesus would have only been 23 or 24 at the start of his ministry, which is only a short time after John the Baptist started his ministry. We must assume that the historical marker given for us in Luke 2:1 and 2 to be an accident and not be worthy of further consideration as a valid historical marker. We actually have additional evidence for this writer's error found in Luke 1 and 5, where we are told that John the Baptist's conception happens in the days of Herod, king of Judea, yet only 6 months later, Jesus is conceived in Luke 1:24 and 26. So this is therefore the more probable story surrounding Jesus' birth. Jesus is conceived in Nazareth in Galilee in the 6th month after Elizabeth had conceived John the Baptist, as stated in Luke 1:24 and 26. After convincing her betrothed husband to marry her, Mary and Joseph make their way down to the hill country of Judea and say, hey, Elizabeth. So they first stop at Elizabeth and Zechariah's for 3 months because 1, it is closer, and 2, because they chose to believe in the supernatural conception due to their own highly improbable conception. So it's like, oh yeah, affirmation. This was a supernatural baby because I had my own supernatural baby because I'm old and withered and I still had a baby. So if you said you had a virgin baby, I totally believe you, girl. After these 3 months, Mary travels further south to the house of her fathers in Bethlehem. Bethlehem. But no one else in the family is inclined to believe in the supernatural conception. So believing Jesus to be a bastard or even a simply disgraceful out-of-wedlock child, the family refuses to have room for Mary to give birth in. So there, the major scene in Bethlehem is ready, with just Mary, Joseph, and the few animals who would have been eaten out of the manger. Jesus is born within the last couple years of Herod the Great's reign, where we have, from what we have discussed so far. Jesus is then taken to Jerusalem to be circumcised. Take that off, yay! Where 2 more wise elders believe that Jesus is the Messiah, Simeon and Anna. And shortly thereafter, Mary visits Elizabeth for encouragement and report of what happened in Jerusalem, then continues home to Nazareth. So on the way back to Galilee, they go sidestep, oh hey, Elizabeth, yay, we did this, yay, we got the Messiah baby, everyone's happy, and then go back to Galilee where everything is nice and safe. In the meantime, for them going back to Nazareth, word around Jerusalem spreads that the Messiah has been born. Eventually, the word reaches King Herod, who then calls the 2 wise prophets into his court and asks them the questions Matthew claims the king asked the Magi. From this point, it is disputed that Herod did not order the slaughter of the toddlers near the village of Bethlehem. I'm personally inclined to believe that he did do it because it is consistent with his character that we are painted throughout history. Like, he murdered his members of his own family, and his sons who were successors to him, he also murdered. So it is consistent with his character to just go off and kill a bunch of people, especially babies in a remote rural area where it doesn't spread around that quickly. It's also not surprising that the act of attempting to kill Jesus to protect his own lineage isn't recorded in official text, because it may have been just a simple verbal order given by the king to kill no more than 30 toddler boys in a small rural village on the hillside of Judea. So like I said earlier, Jesus is not in Egypt at this time when he is a toddler. He is just in Nazareth, unbeknownst to a sick and dying King Herod. Since a couple years is said to have passed before Herod gives the order to kill the babies of Bethlehem, I will comfortably sit Jesus' birthday in the middle of 6 BC. He may have been born as early as 7 BC. He may have been born just months before King Herod died in 4 BC. But given the information we have and adjusted 2 additional years prior to King Herod's death is a safe place to put the date of Jesus' birth. Now, luckily for us, his date of death is actually much easier to calculate. We have enough information that we can get down to the very hour that he died on. It just takes a few different pieces of the puzzle that happen to fit together perfectly with the power of the process of elimination. Firstly, all 4 Gospels agree that the orders to kill Jesus were given by Pontius Pilate. Now, Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea from 26 AD to 36 AD. An initial 10-year time span that we have that we can give Jesus' death. But wait, there is more. Remember earlier in Luke 3:1-2, we are given the earliest time for the start of John the Baptist's ministry, and therefore the very earliest time of Jesus' ministry, the 15th year of Tiberius of Caesar, which begins on September 18th, 29 AD. Then we can add at least 2 years worth of Passovers to this date because, again, one of the common ways that scholars estimate the length of time of Jesus' ministry is the number of Passovers that are recorded through the Gospels. And John's Gospel tells us that he died on the 3rd Passover. So since, Tiberius Caesar in 29 AD, that would make 30 AD the first possible one recorded, then 31 AD the second, and then 32 AD would be the earliest possible date with that logic. Bam! Process of elimination, folks. And it gets even better. We also know that Jesus died on a Friday. That later that evening became the Passover because we know that they were getting prepared for the Sabbath, which is Saturday. I will now show you the list of Passovers that happened between 32 and 36 AD. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, we have a 99.9% certainty of Jesus' date of death. Friday, April 3rd, 33 AD, at approximately 3 p.m. But we don't need to get that specific for the purposes of answering the question of today's video because, well, there's such a big date range for his birth, but at least we can have absolute certainty, almost 100% absolute certainty of his date of death. All right, it's time to do some mathsies. Let's see, we have the date of his death, which is April 3rd, 33 AD. And the latest possible day of his death, if we assume that Josephus' accounts are wrong and just general historians are right, that he died in 4 BC and he died on December 31st of 4 BC and Jesus was born before then the latest, absolute latest possible date that Jesus could have been born would therefore be December 30th, 4 BC. And that gives us the earliest possible date for his time of death, which is 35 years, 3 months, and 4 days. But that is only the youngest possible date of death. That is not even the oldest or the most probable. To calculate the oldest possible date of death, let's assume that 1, everything that happened in the book of Matthew is true and accurate. 2, that Herod died in early 4 BC, like the earliest possible he can die in 4 BC, with his January 1st, 4 BC. Number 3, we are assuming that Herod lived 6 months after proclaiming the slaughter of the innocents before he died. And the fourth and final assumption we have is that Jesus was born exactly 2 years prior to Herod's pronunciation of the slaughter of the innocents. All these plausible but improbable assumptions put together gives us the decent earliest possible date, July 1st, 7 BC. That's the oldest Jesus could possibly be, which gives us the oldest possible date of Jesus' death being 38 years, 9 months, and 2 days. I mean, it is possible he could be older than this, but it takes all of these assumptions to be true and more for it to be happening. So I think this is a good high-level assumption for Jesus' oldest possible date of death. So between the youngest that we had and the oldest, he is definitely between 35 and 38 with like 99.9% certainty. Now for the most probable age of death, I would just use statistical probability and average out the 2 extremes and say Jesus was 36 going on 37. But considering all that we know and all that we don't know, I'd say that there's a 47% chance that Jesus was 36 when he died, 48% chance that he was 37 when he died, and 5% chance of him either being 35 or 38. And it kind of looks like this. I calculated these odds by assuming a normal distribution curve around the average age, which was 36.9. I skewed the data closer to 37 since fewer loopholes needed to be jumped through in order to reach this age. And since Matthew's loopholes are vaguely specific, it is a lot easier to believe that Jesus was between the ages of 1 and 2 when Herod pronounced the slaughter of the innocents than it is to believe that he was between the ages of 0 and 1. However, just for the sake of those who are curious on what my best guess for his birthday is, here is my best guess, and it's about right here-ish, and that is around September 27th, 6 BC. And I have chosen this date for multiple reasons, of course, because I need to have reasons behind me just pulling a date out of my butt. One reason I chose September 27th, 6 BC is because of the whole shepherds being in the fields that we are given account of in the Bible, because shepherds only take their sheep out into the pastures between the months of March and October. The grass dies between October and March in the wintertime. So they basically don't take the sheep out into the fields during the winter because there is no grass. And with everything that we do know up to this point, I would like to appreciate and respect anyone who gives a date between March and October of 6 BC. 2, we can make a more precise time guesstimate whenever we take into consideration the conception of John the Baptist. Since we know Zechariah was of the priestly order of Abijah, that means that the only times where Zechariah could have possibly been performing his priestly duties, which was the 8th priestly course, see 1 Chronicles 26, 6 through 19, we can add approximately 15 months between John's approximate conception and Jesus' birth, giving 6 months between the conception of John the Baptist and Jesus and a 9-month gestation. Abijah's priestly course served in the temple during the 10th and the 34th weeks of the priestly cycle, in addition to Passover, Pentecost, and the Tabernacles festivals. If we consider the 10th and the 34th weeks the only valid options to consider, considering that Luke didn't specify that Zechariah did his priestly duties on a holiday, that would leave only the 10th week as the only date that would work, because if you have Zechariah serving in the 34th week, 15th months after the 34th week would land you in late February, early March, so it's getting a little too close to winter time for the shepherds to be out in the fields, you know what I'm saying? Basically, 15 months after Zechariah served in the temple leads us to about mid-September for Jesus to be born. It should also be noted at this point that the highly respectable scholar Jonathan Cahn put his guess at the also likely date of March 20th, 6 BC. Basically, Cahn accepted what I denied and saying John was conceived around the time of the 34th week of the week of Abijah for Zechariah to bang Elizabeth. And the third reason I chose September 27th, 6 BC as my date of birth for Jesus is that the Quran actually gives us a description of Jesus's birth also. And other than the fact that baby Jesus speaks words to the mother, it says this: "And shake towards thyself, Mary, the trunk of the palm tree. It will let fall fresh ripe dates upon thee." Quran 19:25. In Israel, dates ripen around mid-September. It is just another reason to believe that Jesus was born around mid-September. And 4, I'm going to pull an account of the claim of Jesus being the actual Jewish Messiah. So if you are the Jewish Messiah and you were definitely killed on a Jewish holiday, which is Passover, isn't it just as logical to make yourself be born on a Jewish holiday? September 27th, 6 BC not only fits the above descriptions that I already gave, but it is also the day of the Feast of Tabernacles for that year. Now, I know it is a bit overreaching to connect Jesus's lamb symbolism directly to his birthday, but his lambliness just might be a side effect of who he was destined to be from birth. And since the Feast of Tabernacles is actually one of the pilgrimage holidays for the Jews, it actually gives another better motivation for Mary and Joseph to travel from Nazareth to Bethlehem. It not be for a census, but rather just to be like stop at a family's house so that they could go to the Feast of Tabernacles in Jerusalem shortly thereafter. Since Bethlehem is less than a day's journey away, you can imagine Joseph getting up, getting ready to go to Jerusalem to the Feast of Tabernacles. Okay, Mary, time to go. And then Mary's like, he's coming. And Joseph's like, what? Now we're going to stop. We're not going to go to the Feast of Tabernacles. We're going to stay about here and give birth to baby Jesus. Amen. So in conclusion, my personal best guess age for Jesus' date of death is 37 years, 6 months, and 7 days. Perhaps one day we'll be able to transform September 27th into Christmas and convert December 25th into St. Nicholas Day. It's just a thought. And hey, while we're at it, let's change Easter to always be on April 5th or the closest Sunday to April 5th to make it actually more yearly consistent. But anywho, now as a result of all this research, now you can explain to any novice or expert how Jesus did not die when he was 33 years old, but actually lived 3 or 4 more years. This video was made by Tim and Titus Mabley on a channel called Death of a Notion, and definitely not by people who thought that Jesus died at 33 and then rose again after 3 days. Assuming that the resurrection accounts are accurate, Jesus was actually only in the tomb for less than 48 hours, from 3 p.m. Friday at the earliest to 9 a.m. on Sunday at the latest. If you would like to become more enlightened, depressed, or enraged with us, depending on your previous notions, you can do us a giddy and click on those like and subscribe buttons. And until next time, kumbaya, motherfuckers. Joseph, you are not the father! What?